Hi, this is Colin from Kong3D.com doing my very first tutorial. I had some requests, so here it is. We're going to go over normal mapping and a little bit of baked lighting using a hard surface model in this case. So here I have a building. It's my low poly building. It's not extremely low poly, but it's not high poly either. Anyways, so what I usually do is I'll create a low poly model, and then taking the low poly model, I'll make a high poly model based off of it. Some people like to make the high poly model first and then create a low poly model based off of that. Whatever, it really doesn't matter. The important thing is that your models, they essentially have to have the same silhouette. What that means is you can't really like create for your high poly model, just geometry that doesn't coincide with your low poly model. It essentially they have to be pretty much similar in detail. What it is the high poly has actual like little tiny details, like if you decided to make some cracks or um, maybe the windows, you had actual window frames, stuff like that. It doesn't really affect the entire the silhouette, and that's kind of the idea. You want the silhouettes to be the same. Anyways, so here's my low poly model, and I've already created a high poly model. What I usually like to do is I have them in their own layers. It just makes it a lot more organized. So I'll just hide the low poly right now, and let me just show you what the high poly looks like. Okay, so here's the high poly. It actually looks a lot like the low poly, but a couple things you'll notice is you can actually see like the doors. There's more detail in the doors. The other thing is if I just if I can zoom in here. Okay, so computer's a little bit slow, but if I zoom in here, um, I'm just going to hide the wireframe. I think that's what's slowing down. You can actually see that I've beveled or chamfered some of the edges here, and that's basically gives it a ton of polygons. But it also gives a smooth edge, which is what I want for my high poly model. I want these nice smooth chamfered edges, and the idea is we want to try to get those details. See, like the window frames, you want to get those details into the low poly model without having to need all these polygons, which right now it's just chugging up my computer. The other thing is that they need to be exactly in the same location. So I usually center my low poly model to 0, 0, and that gets it nice and centered, and then I'll just base my high poly model off of that so it's in the same place. But as you can see, they're essentially the same portrait. If I turn them, same profile, if I turn them both on right now. Okay, that didn't really work, but there it is. If I turn them back both on, so you can see they're basically the same profile. The high poly simply has more rounded and a little bit more detail. Um, so the next difference is that you'll see that the low poly is going to have just a gray material. So basically the low poly, you don't want it to have any materials or anything. It's just a geometry. That's what we're focusing on in the low poly model. However, the high poly model, this can be pretty free. I mean, it can be made up of like 100 different pieces. They can all be separate. It can have colors. You can see I've placed colors here, and the reason I'm doing the colors is for the baked lighting, but it doesn't have to have colors. It's more importantly, the high poly model for normal mapping purposes, it just needs to have a good amount of geometry. But in this case, we're also doing baked lighting, and that's why I've gone ahead and given this color. And you can see how everything has colors, and it's really simple, just using shaders. I created materials and just put them on the different polygons of this. If you had separate models, polygons, that's fine. You can still do the same thing, color them all in, whatever. The high poly, you can just think about it as it's just a beautiful model. You could just pretty much do whatever you want with it within the frame of you want to try to keep the profile essentially the same as the low poly, and that's what I've done here. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to show you how we're going to create from this high poly model and the low poly model a normal map using projections. So what I'll do is I'm going to hide my high poly model, and I'm going to just go right to my low poly model. It's important to have these separated because you only want to focus on one thing at a time. Right now I want to focus specifically on the low poly model. And actually, I'm sorry, I want to actually turn them both on at this point. But you'll notice that I have my low poly model is selected, and that's what you want. So with my low poly model selected, not the high poly model, the low poly model. With that selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to rendering, and we're going to choose render to texture. So if I choose render to texture, it's going to give me this sort of render to texture dialog. Now, by default, it's actually supposed to give me a projection map as well, which it didn't. So before I move any further, I'm just going to close this out and go ahead and give myself a projection modifier. I don't know why it doesn't do it. Sometimes it does, and in this case it just doesn't. But the projection modifier, what it does is it'll give you a cage for your low poly model. And now that we have our little cage, I'll go back to rendering, render to texture. Okay, so in this tutorial we're just going to render using scanline. So what I'm going to do is right now, first thing is the setup, which you'll find it right here. I'm going to just go to setup, and it's going to bring up my render. So I'm just going to make sure that it's set right now under assign renderer here, under common assign renderer, default scanline. So there you can see it's set to default scanline, and that's what I'm using for this tutorial. Generally it's easier, but anyways, we're going to go now to renderer. Now this is the really important part of it, and what I need to do is make sure that enable global super sampler is turned on. Usually it's off by default. Turn that on, and what I like to use is max 2.5 star. It's really quick, pretty fast. It's extremely fast for rendering normal maps, and it's pretty good. So it's fast and it's pretty good, so I just use that. Now that's it for this setup. I'll just close it out, so X out of that, and then we'll go back to our render to texture. Now the next step is we move down, and what you're looking for is this projection mapping. It's by default it should be disabled, so you want to enable it, and then it's going to say projection, and then what you want to do is go to the pick. So I click on pick, and what it's going to do is it's going to give you a list of essentially everything else that's in your file. Now in my case I only have the high poly building, and it's only one piece of geometry. If it's if your high poly model is made up of a ton of different pieces, it's going to list them all, and you want to select all of them. So I just select the high poly model and then click add. Alright, once you do that, you'll see the cage starts doing some freaky stuff. That's fine, we'll just ignore that for now, and we'll move forward. The next thing I want to do is right here under mapping coordinates. Now this is very important. What I found is if you use by default it's going to be set to use automatic unwrap. And when you do that, what it does is it creates for you an unwrap that's just not going to work for you. Actually, one thing I forgot to mention was that my low poly model had been unwrapped. So my high poly model doesn't need to be unwrapped, but your low poly model should be unwrapped. So it needs to be unwrapped in order for you to create a proper normal map, texture map, any type of texture map actually for your model. So make sure you unwrap your low poly models before you do this. So we'll just use existing channel and then channel 1. Now the sub object part, it really doesn't matter, but just for the sake of repetition, we'll just keep it, use the same, use existing channel, channel 1. Okay? Next, we're going to move down, and you're going to see this should actually be blank. I'm just going to go ahead and remove it, but what it is this is the list of all the things that you can do. So in this case, we're just going to do two things. We're going to do a normal map, and we're going to do a diffuse map, which is our baked lighting. We're using diffused. So we're going to start with a normal map. What I do is I'm going to create a normal map using the add, and then you'll see here it says add texture to element. We want to choose normals map and then click on add elements. Alright, when it does that, now you're going to see it say here, all this stuff like file name, normal map 256. Don't worry about that, but what's important is that you go down here, and the name, the normals map, that's usually good. I keep that, but the file name and type is important, so we want to change that, and we do that by clicking on the three little dots here. And what this is it's asking us where it wants us to save these maps. Now, I've already created a folder for textures, so I could just save it in there. And I usually, for normal maps, I like to create a very high detail map, and then what I do is I'll shrink it down if I need it to be smaller. I find that if you render big and then shrink it, you retain a lot of detail rather than rendering it at the size, whatever size you decide it to finally be. So I'm going to choose PNG, which is a pretty good for keeping a lot of detail. So, and then I'll go ahead and I'll save that. It's going to ask you, PNG configuration. So you really don't need 48-bit. 24-bit is really enough. The other thing is the alpha channel. We're going to turn that off. In this case, we don't need an alpha channel for normal map. It's just going to be one solid thing. So we'll hit OK. Okay, the next part is the target map slot. Now, what this is it's going to automatically try to, like, after you've done your work, it's going to try to put this map that you've created somewhere as a material onto your model, and that's what it's asking you here. If you don't change this, it's going to just give you an error. Now, excuse me, this doesn't really matter that much because I don't use any of these target maps. But if you want it to just not give you that error, then you can just choose. Like for normal map, it usually goes on the bump, so I'll just select bump. The next thing is going to be the map size. So if we leave this, it's going to be 256 by 256, way too small for us. What I do for my normal maps is I actually make them really massive. So in this case, 2048 by 2048. I make them huge, and what I'll do is I'm not going to keep them that way because you never want to have something that big unless you really need all that. But usually I do it just for normal map purposes. I'll make them big and then shrink them in Photoshop. So 2048, and then finally it says output into normal bump. I leave that off. Render height map, just leave that off as well. And then don't hit render. but that's it for that. We're gonna actually now close this out, so you can just click X, close it out. And what we're doing is now go back to our building. You'll see in the modifier stack here, it's got the projection. And what we're looking for is actually this cage. You can see it right here, this cage. And what we want to do is make sure you click it. So you should see it. There it is, cage. And then we want to choose shaded. And what shaded does is it actually shows us what the cage actually looks like. That's what the cage. Now the idea of the cage is it needs to encompass all of the high poly model. And that's why you want to keep the profiles of the low poly and the high poly model essentially the same. It just makes it so much easier to do this, and it makes it possible to do this. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're actually going to reset. So you see it right here, just hit reset. And basically what that does is it just puts the cage to nothing. So you don't want to leave it this way, but what we're going to do now is I usually just push up the amount, and you could kind of see it kind of going there. And as I push it, I can go in closer to kind of inspect it, and you can see, here it's not. I needed to kind of go out to cover these window details. So you can just keep pushing it, and basically the idea is, as you do this, the cage just sort of grows out. It's not perfect, so you may find that no matter how much you push it up, you don't want to overdo it basically, because when you do that, you just kind of mess it all up. The idea is to get the cage to be as close to the high poly model, and also it needs to encompass all of the high poly model detail. So this looks pretty good, I guess. It's hard for me to tell if it's actually getting the window frames there, but I'm just going to, I suspect that it is, so I'm just going to move on. Okay, the next step, once we have our cage encompassing everything, we're ready to go ahead. Oh, actually, so yeah, so here's what I'm talking about, where you have detail that's sort of poking out, and the idea is I don't want to keep pushing because it'll just kind of push everything out. The idea is I want to just take care of those specific points, and it's really easy. Under here, under projection, you can open this up and select cage, and it'll give you the points for the cage. And if I just using control, if I just select whatever points that are being affected, in this case it's looks like these points right here, and I can just click ignore back facing, so I can just select these without having to worry about accidentally selecting the cage points in the back. So that's a little bit easier. So it's a little bit slow on my end because I'm recording this, and unfortunately my computer's not all the greatest, so I apologize. Okay, we have those cage points, and you can see the high poly model clearly sticking out. So once we have those points, you just move them up like that, and that's fine as long as it's encompassing. Like I said, as long as it's encompassing the high poly model, it'll work. The reason why it's not encompassing this is because this is essentially detail that I created on the high poly model, but the low poly model doesn't have this. The low poly model is basically just a flat surface. So we're going to use normal mapping to get that detail. And that's the idea how you want to create your high poly model. You don't want to actually create like a huge chimney that's, and then your low poly model is a flat surface. It doesn't make sense. But little details like this is how you want to do it. Okay, so that's how we got that. And we're just going to say, okay, our projection mapping is done. We're going to zoom out, ready to zoom out, and then we're ready to render. So it's real simple. Go back to your render to texture. So our cage is all set up. It's all ready to go. All of our settings are good. And actually, one final thing. In order to make your normal map, um, actually no, I think never mind. I'm thinking of something else. Yeah, we're good. So just hit render. And what this is going to do, and it might take a little while, is it just does this kind of default render. This actual render that it shows you on the screen, it doesn't really, I don't use it. It's basically showing you a texture map, a diffuse map of what you have in the scene. But I don't really use that. Um, so just kind of let it do its thing and just wait.